take out your wallet right now. Look at the bill in your hand. That piece of paper, that dollar, is a promise. Nothing more. A promise that someone, somewhere, will accept it in exchange for something real. Food, fuel, your labor. It feels like it's always been this way. Like money has always just been paper, trust, a number that goes up and down. But here's the thing most people don't realize. For nearly 200 years, that wasn't true. For most of American history, the dollar in your pocket wasn't a promise. It was a claim. A physical, verifiable claim on a fixed amount of gold, sitting in a vault, waiting for you. Walk into the right bank, at the right moment in history, and hand over your dollars, and by law, by international agreement, someone would hand you back gold. Not a metaphor, not a policy goal. An exchange rate? Fixed. Guaranteed. That world is gone, and it didn't fade away slowly, worn down by decades of drift. It ended on a single night. One announcement. One president, on television, breaking a promise that had held, with interruptions, but essentially intact, since before your grandparents were born. This is not just a story about gold or exchange rates or a policy most people have never heard of. It's a story about what happens when the thing you were told was permanent turns out to have an expiration date, and nobody tells you when it's coming. So let me take you back to the very beginning. Back to a hotel in the mountains of New Hampshire, in the summer of 1944, where the world's most powerful nations sat down and tried to build something that would never break. It broke anyway. And by the end of this video, you'll know exactly when and exactly why the dollar in your hand today is not the same thing in kind that your ancestors carried in theirs. July 1944. World War II is not yet over, but its outcome already feels certain. And in a resort hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, delegates from 44 allied nations gather for 3 weeks with an audacious goal: design the financial architecture of the entire post-war world, before the war has even ended. Here's the problem they're trying to solve. The interwar years, the 1920s and 30s, had been a currency free-for-all. Nations devalued their money to gain trade advantages over each other. That chaos, most economists agreed, had helped drag the world into a global depression, and from there, into war. Whatever came next had to be different, stable, predictable, anchored to something real. Their solution became known as the Bretton Woods system. And at its center sat one number: $35. Under the agreement, the United States pegged the dollar to gold at a fixed rate, $35 per ounce, a rate that had actually been set back in 1934, but which now became the anchor for the entire system. Foreign governments and central banks, not ordinary citizens, could exchange their dollar holdings for U.S. gold at that fixed rate, no questions asked. Every other major currency in the system, in turn, was pegged to the dollar. The British pound, the French franc, the German mark, all held at fixed exchange rates against the dollar, which itself was tied to gold. The dollar became something like gold's official representative on the world stage, as good as gold, because it was, quite literally, redeemable for it. Here's the thing most people don't realize about what this actually meant in practice. The United States, at the close of World War II, held roughly 70% of the world's official gold reserves, a staggering concentration, the byproduct of a global economy that had spent years shipping gold to America in exchange for war materiel and industrial goods. According to the Bretton Woods historical record maintained by the International Monetary Fund, which the conference itself created, this dominance is precisely what made the dollar-gold peg credible in the first place. The world trusted the dollar because the world could see the gold sitting behind it. For the ordinary American, this system was invisible in daily life. You couldn't personally walk into a bank and demand gold for your paycheck. That right belonged to foreign central banks, not citizens. But its effects were not invisible. A dollar meant something fixed. Prices, over long stretches, held roughly steady, because the money itself could not simply be created without consequence. Inflation, when it happened, was the exception that made headlines. not the quiet, constant hum in the background of American life that later generations would come to expect. This was the paradise before the fall. Not a perfect system. We'll get to its very real strains soon enough. But a world where the word dollar carried a kind of certainty that is almost impossible to imagine today. A world where money was not simply a promise from your government. It was a claim on something the government could not simply print more of. That certainty would last for 27 years. And the question that should already be forming in your mind is the right one. What does it take to break a promise that an entire post-war world had staked itself on? The answer starts, quietly, in the 1960s. To understand what was lost in 1971, you have to understand what the system actually felt like while it lasted. Not in theory, but in practice. Picture an American businessman in 1958, closing a deal with a trading partner in West Germany. He doesn't need to worry about wild currency swings eating into his profit margin between the handshake and the payment. The exchange rate between the dollar and the German mark isn't floating freely, reacting to speculation and rumor. It's fixed, locked in place by international agreement. A dollar today is worth roughly the same in marks as a dollar next month, and the month after that. For businesses operating across borders, this predictability was not a minor convenience. It was the foundation that let post-war global trade expand at a pace the world had never seen. Here's the thing most people don't realize. This stability wasn't just useful for corporations and central banks. It shaped ordinary expectations about money itself. A family saving for a house in 1955 could reasonably expect that a dollar saved today would still buy roughly a dollar's worth of goods in 5, even 10 years. Wages negotiated in union contracts didn't need built-in assumptions about relentless, creeping price increases, because relentless, creeping price increases weren't the norm. According to long-run inflation data compiled by the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis, U.S. inflation during the height of the Bretton Woods years remained low and remarkably stable compared to both the decades before and the decades that would follow. This is the part of the story that's easy to romanticize, so let's be honest about it. The gold-backed dollar was not some libertarian utopia. It required constant, careful management by central bankers on both sides of the Atlantic. The system depended on the United States running responsible fiscal and monetary policy, spending and printing within limits that kept the gold peg credible. It depended on other nations trusting American restraint. It was less a law of nature than a carefully balanced agreement, held together by discipline and mutual confidence. And discipline, as any historian of empire or economics will tell you, is the hardest thing for a dominant power to maintain once it stops feeling necessary. By the late 1950s and into the 1960s, the United States began doing something that, on the surface, looked like ordinary superpower behavior: spending abroad. Military bases across Europe and Asia, foreign aid programs, and starting in the mid-1960s, an escalating war in Vietnam, paired at home with the ambitious social spending of President Johnson's Great Society programs, new investments in healthcare, education, and poverty reduction, running at the same time as a costly war. All of that spending sent more and more dollars flowing out of the United States and into foreign hands. And more dollars circulating abroad meant more dollars that foreign governments could, in theory, bring back to the United States and redeem, at that fixed rate of $35 per ounce, for actual American gold. For a while, this didn't feel like a crisis. It felt like the normal cost of being the world's leading power. The dollar was still the dollar. The peg was still the peg. But underneath the surface, a gap was quietly widening between the number of dollars the world was holding and the amount of gold sitting in Fort Knox and the vaults of the New York Federal Reserve that those dollars were, technically, a claim on. That gap would not stay quiet for long. By the mid-1960s, the gap between paper promises and physical gold had a name, whispered with increasing urgency in finance ministries and central banks around the world: the dollar overhang. Here's what that meant in concrete terms. In 1957, the United States held roughly $22 billion in gold reserves. enough to comfortably cover the dollars circulating abroad, with room to spare. But as the decade wore on, that cushion began shrinking. Vietnam War spending climbed. Great Society programs expanded. Imports grew as European and Japanese industry, rebuilt after the war with American help, began competing seriously with American manufacturing for the first time. Dollars kept flowing out. Gold, increasingly, followed them. By the late 1960s, according to Treasury Department historical records, U.S. gold reserves had fallen by roughly half from their post-war peak, even as the total volume of dollars held by foreign governments and institutions had grown far beyond what those remaining reserves could cover, if every dollar holder had shown up at once and demanded gold. That last part is the key to understanding the crisis. Bretton Woods never required, and was never designed to survive, every dollar being redeemed simultaneously. It worked on the same principle as a bank. Not every depositor withdraws on the same day. But confidence, once it starts to crack, has a way of accelerating its own collapse. And by 1965, some of America's own allies were starting to test that confidence directly. That year, French President Charles de Gaulle made headlines by publicly criticizing what he called America's exorbitant privilege, the unique power the United States held simply because the dollar, not any other currency, sat at the center of the entire system. France began deliberately converting its dollar holdings into gold, shipping the bullion home in a pointed demonstration that the peg was not, in fact, unbreakable. Other nations watched. Some quietly followed. Here's the thing most people don't realize. This wasn't a fringe concern debated only by economists. By 1968, the strain had become severe enough that the United States and its allies were forced to create an emergency two-tiered gold market. One official price for government transactions, one floating price for private markets, just to relieve pressure on the system without abandoning the peg outright. It was, in effect, a patch. A sign that the original design could no longer hold under its own rules. Richard Nixon inherited this problem when he took office in January 1969. He did not create the dollar overhang. He did not start the Vietnam War, though he would preside over years more of it. What he inherited was a system quietly bleeding gold, propped up by patches, with foreign governments growing more openly skeptical by the year that the United States could honor its $35 promise indefinitely. By the summer of 1971, the bleeding had accelerated into something closer to a run. Britain, in August of that year, formally requested that a significant portion of its dollar holdings be converted to gold, a request that, by some accounts reaching Nixon's advisors, helped crystallize the sense that the moment for half measures had passed. The math had become inescapable. The United States could keep the gold window open and watch its reserves drain towards zero, a genuine risk of the government being unable to honor its own currency. Or it could do something no administration had done before, sever the link entirely, and hope the world's trust in the dollar would hold anyway, promise or no promise. Nixon chose the second option, and he chose to announce it not through the Treasury Department, not through a written statement, but live, on national television, on a Sunday night, when he knew all three networks would carry it and nearly the entire country would be watching. Sunday, August 15th, 1971. 9 o'clock at night, Eastern Time. Across the United States, television sets are tuned to Sunday programming, the last lazy evening of summer before another week begins. And then, without much warning, the networks cut away. The President of the United States is about to address the nation. Richard Nixon sits behind his desk in the Oval Office. His tone is calm, almost reassuring, the tone of a man delivering necessary but manageable news, not the tone of someone announcing an irreversible historical rupture. He speaks about jobs, about inflation, about America's competitive position in the world. And then, roughly midway through the address, he says the words that would end an era. He announces that he has directed the Secretary of the Treasury to suspend, temporarily, the convertibility of the dollar into gold, except in amounts and conditions determined to be in the interest of monetary stability. In plainer language, the gold window, open in one form or another for the better part of 4 decades, is closed. Foreign governments can no longer walk up and trade their dollars for American gold at $35 an ounce. Not today. Not, as it would turn out, ever again. Here's the thing most people don't realize about that word. Temporarily. Nixon framed the entire announcement as one piece of a broader emergency economic package, alongside a 90-day freeze on wages and prices and a new tax on imports. The gold suspension was presented as a defensive maneuver, a way to stop foreign speculators from draining American reserves while the country got its footing back. Nothing in the speech suggested this was meant to be the permanent, final word on how the dollar would work for the rest of American history. It was sold as a pause, a tactical retreat. It was never reversed. No subsequent administration, not Nixon's, not any president in the more than 5 decades since, ever restored dollar-to-gold convertibility. There was no follow-up announcement declaring the old system officially, permanently over. It simply never came back. The emergency measure quietly became the permanent architecture, one presidential term folding into the next, until the temporary suspension had outlasted the man who declared it by decades. The immediate reaction, both at home and abroad, was disorientation more than outrage. Stock markets, in the days that followed, actually rose. Investors, at least initially, read the move as decisive action addressing a real problem, and the accompanying wage price freeze and import measures dominated headlines just as much as the gold announcement itself. According to contemporary reporting archived by outlets including the New York Times, much of the immediate domestic conversation focused on inflation and jobs, not on the deeper structural shift of severing money from any physical anchor at all. Internationally, the response was more consequential. Within months, the fixed exchange rate system that had defined Bretton Woods since 1944 began unraveling entirely. By 1973, the world's major currencies had moved to floating exchange rates, values determined not by fixed agreements pegged to gold, but by markets, trading freely against one another based on supply, demand, and confidence. The dollar itself was now, for the first time since the 1930s, backed by nothing physical at all. No gold, no silver, nothing you could walk into a vault and claim. It was, and is, what economists call fiat currency, money that has value because a government declares it does, and because enough people continue to trust that declaration, not because it represents a fixed claim on something tangible sitting in a vault. Think about the weight of that shift for a moment. For nearly 2 centuries, with real interruptions but a real underlying anchor, the word dollar had meant something you could, in principle, trace back to a physical object. After August 15, 1971, it meant a promise. Full stop. A promise backed by the credit and the trust of the United States government, and nothing else. Nixon called it temporary. History would prove otherwise. Here's what nobody tells you about the end of the gold standard. There was no single day when America woke up and collectively grieved what had been lost. There was no funeral for the gold-backed dollar. There was just Monday morning, and then another Monday after that, and another, stretching into months, then years, then decades, until an entire way of thinking about money simply became the water everyone swam in without noticing. By the mid-1970s, floating exchange rates and unbacked paper currency weren't an emergency measure anymore. They were just how money worked. An entire generation would grow up never knowing a world where you could, in principle, trade your dollars for gold at a fixed government-guaranteed rate. For them, this wasn't a loss. It was simply the baseline reality of what a dollar was. And there's a related thread worth pulling on here, because it adds texture to just how thoroughly the government's relationship with gold had shifted over the 20th century. Back in 1933, nearly 4 decades before Nixon's announcement, President Franklin Roosevelt had signed Executive Order 6102, a Depression-era measure that made it illegal for most American citizens to privately own gold bullion, or gold coins, in significant quantities, requiring them to sell their holdings to the government at a fixed price. For over 40 years, private citizens couldn't legally hoard gold even if they wanted a personal hedge against the very kind of currency uncertainty that would eventually arrive in 1971. That restriction wasn't lifted until 1974, when Congress passed legislation restoring Americans' right to own gold freely again, just 3 years after the metal had stopped backing their money at all. The timing is almost too fitting. Citizens regained the legal right to hold gold at almost the exact moment the dollar in their wallets lost its claim on any. Now here is the part of this story that connects directly to your life today, whether you've ever thought about it or not. Since 1971, the US dollar has lost the overwhelming majority of its purchasing power, not because of some single catastrophic event, but through a slow, continuous, compounding erosion that a gold-anchored dollar structurally could not produce in the same way. According to inflation calculators maintained by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, a dollar in 1971 had the purchasing power of what would require roughly $7 to $8 to match today, meaning something that cost $1 the week of Nixon's announcement would cost you $7 or $8 now. This is why a dollar doesn't stretch the way your grandparents remember it stretching. This is why prices only ever seem to climb, rarely to fall, year after year, decade after decade, in a way that would have been genuinely abnormal under the old system. This is why the phrase, "back in my day, a dollar could buy," isn't just nostalgic exaggeration. It's a mathematically precise description of a fundamentally different monetary reality, one where the dollar was a claim on something fixed, not a promise that erodes by design. None of this makes the pre-1971 world some lost libertarian paradise, and it's worth resisting that temptation. The gold-backed era had its own real strains, as you've seen, a system held together by careful discipline that was, by its final decade, already cracking under pressures no one had fully anticipated. This isn't a simple story of a golden age followed by decline. It's a story of one carefully balanced system reaching the limits of what it could bear and being replaced, almost overnight, by something far less anchored, a replacement whose full consequences are still working themselves out in your paycheck, in your grocery bill, in every price tag you'll see for the rest of your life. The dollar you're holding right now is not the same kind of thing your great-grandparents held. It looks the same, it spends the same, but it is, at its core, a fundamentally different invention, one with a precise, documented birthday, August 15th, 1971. So where does that leave us? Not with a simple villain, and not with a simple lesson. Nixon didn't wake up one Sunday looking to strip the dollar of its anchor out of greed or carelessness. He inherited a system already straining under decades of accumulated pressure, a system that, by 1971, may genuinely have had no clean way to survive intact. The gold-backed dollar wasn't destroyed by a single bad decision. It was a carefully balanced arrangement that had quietly outgrown its own foundations, and the man in the Oval Office that August night was the one left holding a decision nobody could postpone any longer. But understanding why it happened doesn't erase what it means for you. Every dollar you earn, save, and spend today exists inside a system that has no fixed anchor at all. A system built, almost by accident, out of what was supposed to be a temporary Sunday night patch. That's not a conspiracy. It's just history, documented and traceable to a specific date, and it's worth knowing, the same way it's worth knowing why your paycheck gets taxed before it ever reaches you, or why prices climb every single year like it's simply the law of nature. If this story changed the way you think about the money sitting in your wallet right now, that's exactly what this channel exists to do. Take the parts of American history that hide in plain sight and pull them into the light. If you want more of that, hit subscribe. It genuinely helps this channel keep telling these stories. And I want to hear from you directly on this one. Do you think a system anchored to something physical, gold, or anything else, would even be possible in today's world? Or has the world moved permanently past the point where that kind of anchor could ever work again? Tell me in the comments. Some of the best conversations on this channel happen right there. If this is the first time you're pulling on this particular thread, the invisible architecture behind the money and the government you deal with every day, there's another one waiting for you. Before 1913, the United States funded its entire government without any income tax at all, for over a century. So how did it survive? That's the story waiting in the video linked right here. America had no income tax until 1913. How did the government survive? Go watch it next.